Hello and welcome to the Pocket Dojo podcast, the show where we talk about making the world a better place by making better things. I'm Paul Crick.
And I'm Asha Singh.
Today, it's Asha's turn to lead the conversation, so let's dive in.
Today, I'm talking with Dr. Claudine Perlet, not a medical doctor, but a woman leader working in the wide field of regeneration, system design, and transformative change, who brings a very different set of experience, skills, background, etc., to the work that she and I do, which is why I invited her on the podcast to get a very different kind of story and build on the practice that we have. So welcome, Claudine. It's very good to see you here.
Thanks again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great, fantastic. So Claudine, we don't know each other very well. We've only spoken a couple of times, but I really get the sense from the story that you told me of your life journey so far, that you have many talents and many stories to share with us. So rather than introduce you, what would you like to share about yourself just to get our conversation started today?
Yeah, and I knew you would ask me something along those lines. I was actually thinking, and how do I not start to make this difficult right from the start? Because there's, sort of like the conventional way of, what do you do and who are you? So, and in conventional terms, I would say like I'm a lawyer, consultant, coach. And I also, at the same time, feel very uncomfortable with the notions that are attached to it. So that I would, refer to myself more as a bridge builder and a guide, maybe, and someone who likes to challenge the status quo. And this very much into, sort of transformative change and how do we make the world a better place. Mm-hmm. And there's my, I'm very focused on the business and financial sector and how we hopefully reintegrate that into how the planet actually works.
So, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Wonderful. So you're very welcome to sell your stories here in whatever way feels right for you. We have no kind of right or wrongs or anything like that. So as I think Claudine, the Pocket Dojo podcast, we started because we really want to talk about regenerative leadership and organizational development, particularly in the kind of context that you've just started to touch on, where life or business as usual couldn't be more different and very far away from anything that for most people, anything, that resembles a living systems kind of view, let's say. So let's start our conversation in earnest, let's say, with quite a challenging question that I think really, interests both of us and many others as well. And it's really about, how much regeneration do you feel is possible, from your experience in finance in particular, in other arenas, how much regeneration, Claudine, do you think is actually really possible in a system, in a wider environment, in a world that is so focused on extraction and to our minds, degeneration?
Yeah, that's a big question. And maybe before sort of we go into detail there, I would just like to talk just a moment how I got to this whole field, sort of to be able to sort of actually think about questions like that. Because, I was also I was 20 years in financial services and, in different leadership positions across the globe. And in 2017, I got this this feeling that I couldn't really point my finger on, that something was utterly wrong, but I couldn't really tell what it was, right? So, and I went on a deep learning journey and, familiarized myself with, tried to understand the world that had some problems that I couldn't really define, right?
Right.
So, so I got deeply into everything, personal development, inner development, trauma work, but also regenerative economics, with John Fullerton and the community around him. And then start to think about, okay, how to bring all of that knowledge back to, the system I came from. So, and, sort of in the process of doing that, I also thought very deeply about this question that you just raised, because I designed this program for the Paradigm Changer program for senior leaders who are sort of feel a calling to do big changes to big business. And the more I looked at it, the clearer it became that it's very difficult at the moment to really arrive at a regenerative approach in the way we have set up our economies, right? So, and therefore, this question eventually arose to say, okay, how much regeneration is actually possible in regenerative systems? And where I arrived for myself is that I think, for me personally, I can do things. So I can change my consumption patterns. I can change the way I, sort of my nutrition and live a healthy lifestyle, quote unquote. But when you step back and look at the big picture, quickly I come, there are, borders to what I can do. Because where do I buy the food that is really coming from regenerative agriculture? Where do I live? Do I live in a building where people have thought about, circular and how to, sort of regenerate, the material that is used later on? No, how do I move around in the world? Like mobility. I'm a child of globalization. So now I have friends across the world. So what do? Just stop seeing them, right? And work. Most importantly, what kind of work do I do? And, what kind of work can I do to pay the bills, without being complicit to a system that degenerates? So, so therefore, and I think we touched on this in a previous conversation. It's I came up with that idea, being a lawyer, could I sort of claim that I have a right to do no harm? Rather than only a right to not harm others, could I claim a constitutional right that conditions are created that allow me to actually live a regenerative life where I sort of contribute to the planet rather than, sort of help to degrade it? Because, I'm sort of forced into a lifestyle that doesn't really leave me much room to maneuver.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's always interesting when we talk, to people who on the surface of things, have a very different life journey, let's say, to our own. And then we realize that actually once we start to tell those stories and go into a bit more depth, there's a lot of similarity, whatever path that we've taken, particularly if we arrive at the sort of, decision that you or the feeling rather that you just described, back in 2017, when you just knew that something you couldn't continue. These are my words, obviously, but you couldn't continue doing what you were doing, which I had a similar experience. I've had similar experiences in different arenas, and one for me kind of very clearly post-pandemic. I realized that I couldn't continue, apart from the fact it actually wasn't possible because the industry was quite literally on the ground. I was working in aerospace. I couldn't continue doing what I was doing in the way that I'd been doing it because I suddenly started to see so many, different threads coming together and whatever. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that legal ground, because that's not something I really know anything about. Do we have strong legal grounds to make the kind of choices or have them legislated? A lot of people would say that to have any real change in the world, we need to get that mandated, which for those of us working in these kind of arenas of transformational change, etc., particularly from a living systems perspective, we might disagree with quite strongly. But what are the kind of legal, I'm not sure if I'm phrasing the question the right way, but I want to just understand a bit more from, your vast experience, what kind of legal grounds we have for making that kind of choice.
Well, I would say it's limited. Sort of I recently, like at that scale that I have sort of outlined, and I just recently checked with ChatGPT and just thought out of fun, what would it say, to that? And it was interesting because it says there's currently no constitutional right as such, but and no jurisprudence supporting that. But ethically, it would be desirable, right? So I thought, oh, that's a very interesting perspective, and that maybe over time, with the changing cultural perception, it would be maybe possible. And I thought, oh, see, that's a very progressive perspective. So, but, on the right to do no harm, like the constitutional lawyers I spoke to so far, they were sort of like charmed by the idea, but thought it would be really, really, really difficult. So therefore, I think it would be, interesting for campaigning more than anything else to bring awareness to the topic. Other than that, on the legal side, of course, there is climate litigation on the rise, and it's quite successful. And there are also constitutional rulings, also in Germany, for intergenerational responsibility on climate change. So there is stuff happening. And of course, the other major development is, the rights for nature, which isn't so prominent yet. I think in Europe, like there's in Spain, there are some things actually, sort of some smaller activities happening even in Bavaria, I recently read. But Australia, New Zealand, there it's maybe, like, at least from what I'm aware of, they have also thought quite thoroughly about how this actually then works in practice. Because who represents the river in court, right? So, and there is sort of other countries where this procedural aspect falls short still, right? Sort of there's this general notion, but in practical terms, how do you then actually enforce it in a court of law? So there are developments, and I still have got the right to do no harm on my to-do list.
Yeah, great. Good. Keep me posted. I'd love to, I'm sure lots of people would love to hear more about that, because I think that's a really interesting and important area that is ripe for exploration and so on. But coming back to business, so an area that we both have some experience in, and trying to bring about change, systemic change in particular. I wonder. Well, I'm sure you probably heard very similar kind of things to the things that I'm often told. Systemic transformation takes too long, doesn't bring the results we need. It doesn't involve people in the way that they want to be. They don't find it, rewarding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, particularly in the world of finance, which is, I have also done some work for various banks and financial houses and whatever. So it's a very process-driven, I think, was my experience, a very process-driven environment, where leadership, takes on a different kind of meaning, etc. I'm just curious if you're willing to share with us, Claudine, some of the challenges you've had or experienced, doing this kind of work in the arenas that you move in. And rather than ask, how have you overcome them? And to me, it's more about how are you able to transform them in some way? And I realize, for all of us, it's limited.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just quickly to set a bit of context, the two things I do is, like, one, I've designed my own program, like the Paradigm Changer program, which is very much focused on the corporate side. And it's for leaders who are not willing to accept the status quo anymore, and who are not satisfied anymore with the current mitigation measures. Right. And it combines the inner work with the outer work. This is one of the things that I, found for myself, that if you don't really readjust the inner compass with all the cultural imprint that we have, it's very difficult to produce something new, So that's the one thing. And the other thing is system change investing, which I co-founded with Frank Dixon, who is the former head of research of Innovest, which is now MSCI, so big ESG rating agency. And there we're very much promoting an investment approach that looks at the root causes of our global challenges, which we see in the system configuration by allowing for externalities, by allowing companies to harm the the environment and social settings. So sort of like not holding them fully responsible. So this is a big step for a lot of people when you're asking about challenges, right? We're having lots of discussions with people who will, behind closed doors, agree.
Sure.
And then to really take action. There's at the moment generally, I think, sort of this holding pattern, right? I think we see a bit of a backlash in sustainable investing, responsible investing anyway. So, and I think part of it is triggered by, first of all, now this is getting really serious. It is really starting to affect me personally.
Right.
But also, like, what we've done so far doesn't seem to be working. So therefore, I'm very confident that eventually things will be moving forward, because there's no other option. There's no other way, right? You can't vote out climate change. You can't just vote for another party and then hope it goes away. It seems at the moment we need to take this extra loop, unfortunately, in my view. But it will only make matters worse because we're waiting longer. But eventually, I think that the tide will turn, and there will be far more openness. And this is where also, where I think in my program, the inner work is so important, and people will not stop to shy away from, oh my God, this is all whatever, it's supposed to be in a business context. It's actually integral part of the business context already. People just don't call it that. And then on the, systemic approaches, I think also there people will start to see that what we're trying to do with system change investing is a rather elegant solution that is scalable and is actually also helping to mitigate risk substantially in the long-term portfolios in particular, so that that we'll see a change of hearts. At the moment, it's still an uphill battle.
Which, I'm sure all of us working in similar arenas can empathize with and agree with, because it's very similar for all of us. As you're talking, as I'm listening to you, Claudine, I can hear lots of the areas of regenerative leadership, let's say, practice that we talked about, Paul Crick and my co-host here on the podcast, and I talked about in the first series. So, nourishing relationships, talking to lots of people, building that trust, etc. Telling the truth, which is really hard to do. Well, we're all, when we work in an organization, I'm not saying that people are intentionally lying. I mean, some might, but, people, I think, generally don't do that. But the system constrains our behavior. There are things that you can't talk about. It's just not acceptable. It creates more trouble, than any value that comes from it, etc. But it's so fundamental, like you say, climate change is not going to go away. And it's not because we changed the color of the political, leaders that something's going to be different and whatever. Although, of course, people, would like to believe that. Of course we would. And also, about reframing, so looking at these big problems that we have and saying, okay, so how could we turn them into opportunities? That sounds a little bit glib, a little bit kind of, too easy, whatever. I don't intend it in that way at all. But, the things that we've put into place, like you say, the mitigation that has been happening for decades, it's not exactly new. And we don't need to go into that conversation, but it's not working. It's not working at the scale and the speed that it needs to for people to be able to make it through, certain challenges and whatever. So, we would be wise, particularly, you touched earlier on drawing in lots of threads from what you've just said, but you touched on, the fact of ethics and ChatGPT saying that ethically it would be a good idea to change how we, think about life, etc. And of course, ethics is obviously a big question and debate and challenge in AI and all the rest of it. But, the potential is also there. And I'm not a big AI fan. I will add that in. But, the potential there is that there is the potential that we could do all sorts of things and lean into these challenges rather than try and stop them, whatever. But I'm curious then, actually, I want to just shift in a slightly different direction, if I may, Claudine. And, for you as a senior leader with lots of experience, obviously there's a certain kind of comfort, attached to that economically and whatever, but the choice to step out of everything that you've done, and the worlds that you'd moved in that brought you success and recognition or whatever, is, I think, I look at, people I know working in organizations, and I think many of them actually would like to step out, but don't know how to, for whatever reason. That's, complex. It's not an easy thing to identify or say, do it like this. But I'm just curious what your words of wisdom, through your experience, Claudia, and I'm sure you have many, would be for leaders who are, like you say, people who come in your program, for example, people who know that they cannot continue with business as usual, Horizon 1, whatever we want to call it, in extractive economy, they can't do it anymore, and are looking for that, opportunity to do the inner work. I do similar kind of things, the inner work, and then how does that, what does that happen in the spaces between us, let's say, when we bring a different element of ourselves? So what would your words of wisdom be for other leaders, Claudine, who might be on a similar journey?
Yeah, that's a great question, of course.
The $1 billion
question. I mean,
yeah.
I think also from what I've seen in the last few years in these communities, and so particularly I see younger people really struggling to staying in the corporate environment. There's some very enlightened young people around, and they really suffer. And then in that context, the major obstacle comes also very apparent very quickly, and that is there's no established landing strip on the other side. So there is a year's place to go, right? And therefore, I think like cleaning up your finances, being realistic about what's possible for you is very important. And sort of, and at the same time, there are many people who could afford easily and still don't do it, right? So there's then you come to the underlying fears to deal with, right? Stepping out of the tribe.
The inner work, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly.
Which is then the inner work. But I think like the very practical terms is just, sort of be very realistic about what you can do. And I mean, even work 20 hours so that you don't have that problem, and then educate yourself, the other 20 hours. I've seen that model with young people also. Then they do Sean Fullerton's course also and trying to get into the community. So I think that's very important. Is also, get healthy, a program from system, sort of like really take a good look at your consumption patterns. Get enough sleep, reduce your exposure to social media and advertising, right? Spend lots of time in nature, consider, having a garden, spending time there. So, sort of that I think would be, and also like very important, of course, sort of finding the others, sort of like, find your tribes where you feel more at home. Right. And that for me was also a process. Like by now, I think I have slowly but surely created a community, or am part of communities with people who see the world more like I do. Right. And that is also that is actually also, that really adds to life quality. Right. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, I would say.
It's wonderful advice. I need to take more of that myself, actually. So I think self-care also is just absolutely essential. and, weaving these relationships, a community in a global village. It's a rather trite expression these days, but, it's true that there are lots of people around the world that feel like this in all sorts of different environments, and they're coming together in lots of different groups. It's not, sort of one global platform in that sense, but people coming together in lots of different groups, trying to do things locally, doing small things. Like you say, it can be a community garden. It can be, your own choices about single-use plastic or whatever, feels particularly important to us. And there is no certain path. There is no one way. There is no, like you say, there's no landing strip on the other side. It's all about, learning to adapt at the edge of chaos, to use that expression, from complexity and whatever. And that's really scary, for a lot of people who've been used to a world based on the complete opposite, which is at the end of the day, falling apart these days. So, Claudine, we're coming to the end of our conversation, unfortunately, today. I think we could talk for hours and weeks. Actually, maybe we will, which would be great. But I have 5 surprise, or let's call them quick fire questions that you haven't seen. If you would be happy to play along.
Of course.
Fantastic. Great. So question number 1, Claudine, maybe you've answered it, but I would like to just get a little bit more kind of visibility, let's say, see a little bit more. So the question number 1 is one consistent non-negotiable practice. So in other words, something you need to do regularly that is regenerative for you.
The one practice that I didn't mention earlier that I will now use this question to say is find your purpose. Know exactly what your piece of the puzzle in this evolving world is. That is, for me, lots of people don't do it. And they're sort of like, I think it's absolutely essential. There's great work, like Tim Kelly in the US is doing great work with his coaches on that. Do that.
Great, that's a great idea. I'm going to go and check that out as well, because mine keeps changing, which is part of the reason I think I'm not having quite the impact I might like to. Okay, question number 2. In a way, it feels slightly redundant given some of the stories you've just told us, but I'm going to ask you anyway. One thing you'd still like to develop, or one thing you'd like to change about yourself to have even greater impact than you do now?
Well, it's a process. There is, I would never. There is no end point to this process. So I continually evolve, and that is on the inner as well as on the outer. I learn new things on the, business model, system change, and also about myself. It's really a continuation more than one particular thing.
Absolutely. I love that quote from Michelangelo, I think it is. Not long before he finished, well, he didn't actually finish his last work, but not long before he passed away, that I'm still learning. That never stopped. It's a continual process and so key, what you're saying. Okay, question number 3 and question number 4 I'm going to put together. So somebody who really has really inspired you in your life, and why?
Daniel Schmachtenberger.
Daniel, you've inspired too many people. I didn't know you were going to say that. That's great. Well, I'd probably say the same usually.
Yeah.
Okay, why? I mean, maybe that. But for people who don't know him or might find him challenging, actually, his eloquence is astonishing, quite frankly. Why has he inspired you in particular?
Well, I think he's one of the deepest thinkers that I can think of that's around, and that I've come across every time again, like just this latest talk with Nate Higgins, whose work I also like a lot. It's just always so eloquent and so thought through, and constantly reminding us to really understand the problem before we just kick into action. Which is so important, I think, and all the other 25,000 things he sort of reminds us of. So yeah, he's one who stands out, and there are many others, and I've listed them all on my website, and they're all great. But when you ask this way, this is what comes up.
Yeah, great. I'll make sure he watches this as well. Fantastic. And then last but not least, the biggest aspiration you have, Claudine, for the world?
Well, that we really managed to reintegrate how we look at, and how we run our economies and our financial systems into how the planet actually works. Right? I can see, I mean, it will happen eventually anyway, like no civilization ever won against nature. So, but I would like to see some of this already happening in my lifetime. And that's what I, get up for every day.
Wonderful. That sounds like a pretty clear and valuable purpose to me. That sounds also like a beautiful place to end our conversation for today, Claudine. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing your stories and your wisdom on the show today. And I hope that you'll come back and share a bit more with us on another occasion.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure. And I would love to continue the conversation. There are many threads, I think, where we could go and explore further.
Fantastic. Let's do that.
Thank you.